Okay, and we are live. Hello and welcome to the first of the 2022-2023 ENSO seminars. I am delighted to be joined to be kicking off this series by Amanda Corris of Wake Forest University in North Carolina. Amanda came out of the University of Cincinnati, was it? And from there has spent the last couple of years in the Philosophy of Science Lab at the University of Minnesota, on a postdoc there before moving to Wake Forest. So welcome, Amanda, and thanks very much for kicking off this series of ENSO seminars for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So should I go ahead and share my screen?
Sure, yeah, we can kick off. I guess we might, I've invited you to sort of join in our tradition of a commercial break to get things kicked off directly with a bit of advertising.
Yeah, great. So I wanted to share with everyone the Hidden Talents Lab, which is coming out of the University of Utah. Some developmental psychologists who are interested in coming up with this new model for understanding stress-adapted cognition, which is, of course, what I'll be talking about. Do you have the link in the chat there?
I've just posted that to the chat.
Perfect.
So
all right.
It'll be available on the YouTube live chat.
Yeah, great. Okay, so like I said, they're doing some really interesting work in understanding the cognitive capacities, abilities that develop in harsh environments, and how we might reconceptualize those as being adaptive rather than just deficient. And so there are a number of publications that have come out from the lab that are, I think, really fascinating. And of course, I'll talk about those. There are some media links as well, which cover some really interesting aspects of their work. So I just thought I would share their work with everyone here.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. I look forward to digging into that. Great. So yeah, we've a number of people live with us via the live stream, and I think we may well, as I mentioned, we may well have one or two people joining for the live Q&A towards the end within the session. But so if you're watching live, feel free to ask a question via the YouTube chat function, and I'll relay that into the discussion. And obviously, if we people join live, they'll be able to speak for themselves. So, in the meantime, Amanda, I would like to invite you to share your screen, and we can kick off with the September 2022 ENSO seminar.
Great, thank you. Okay. Let's see. Are you able to see that all right?
That's all good.
Okay. There we are. All right. Great. So thank you so much again. I'm very excited to have this opportunity and to share some work that I've been doing on the concept of stress, which is perhaps a very timely one. It's also a very complicated one. And so that's the sort of work that we've been looking at. Oops, there we go. In terms of understanding how to conceptualize stress and what we might find when we reconsider how we typically talk about stress. And so the title of my talk is Stress-Adapted Cognition, Precarious Environments, and Ecological Sensitivity to Context. And I have fire as my example. I know I have in the logo for the talk, I gave lightning as an example. They both sort of work because they both convey the sense of something being maybe dangerous, but also very powerful, right? So there's good and bad effects that come from that, much like stress. So, all right. So this project is really coming out of my work on a grant project that I was involved in as a postdoc in my previous role on the creative role of stress in evolution and development, both from a biological side and from a psychological side. And so what we were interested in looking at is how to conceptualize stress, how it's sort of being used and studied in both psychology and in biology. And what we found so far is that stress is really conceptually ambiguous. It's very multifaceted, and that a generic understanding of stress really sort of fails to capture the context sensitivity of stress. So we've been really carefully looking at how exactly, context sensitive stress really is. And so what I'm interested in, of course, as an enactive thinker, is what an enactive understanding of stress might look like. And so what I'm hoping to investigate in this work is how we might think of the nature of stress from an enactive perspective and how that might aid in really sort of capturing the nuances of the effects of stress, right? Really capturing the context sensitivity of stress. Good. Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about a couple of models, both from sort of biologically informed psychological research and more developmental psychology research with a particular case study in education. So there are really interesting implications for this view for understanding education. And then from there, I'm going to give an outline of what I think an enactive understanding of stress might look like. And then as sort of an offshoot from that, I'm going to look at what I'm calling mismatches between cognitive strategies and environmental settings and the effects of those. So I'll, of course, explain what those terms are referring to, but I think this is sort of really where the meat is in terms of understanding the effects of stress. All right. So the adaptive calibration model is a model that is coming out of some work by biologically informed psychologists who were interested in capturing how stress actually shapes and directs development in such a way that leads to certain outcomes in terms of certain traits that might develop along the lines of certain life history strategies. So the adaptive calibration model postulates that individual differences in stress responsivity are largely, though not exclusively, the result of conditional adaptation. So the evolved ability of an organism to modify its developmental trajectory and thus the resulting phenotype in order to match the local conditions of the social and physical environment. And so this is a conceptual structure here of the adaptive calibration model. This paper is a really nice, very rich overview of how the model can be conceptualized and sort of different concepts that are going into that. And what I really want to emphasize is what the model is really picking out is this matching of the local conditions. So the idea is that in the stress response system, as an individual develops, it sort of gathers information about life history relevant dimensions such as unpredictability, extrinsic morbidity, mortality, right, novelties and opportunities in the environment, unpredictable and uncontrollable events, and so on. And so that sort of is built into the system and then is sort of shaped over time in order to result in particular traits that develop that are going to be relevant to adapting to those particular conditions. So more sort of unstable or harsh environments will result in traits that are adaptive for dealing with those circumstances. So one thing that I wanted to point out in particular from this model is, they say that individual variation in responsivity is primarily seen as the result of adaptive mechanisms rather than the outcome of pathological or dysfunctional processes. So what they're really sort of emphasizing, and this is going to be emphasized in the next model that I'll discuss, is that we should see stress responsivity as being adaptive rather than just pathological or just dysfunctional. Often we think about stress as having only sort of negative effects, but what they're interested in looking at here, when we look more carefully at the outcomes in this matching to a particular environmental context, that we see that it's actually adaptive. Okay. So the next model that I'm interested in looking at here is called the hidden talents model, and I'll go into the details on that. But where these psychologists are coming from is looking at traditional deficit models of cognitive development, where individuals develop deficiencies in cognitive skills and abilities. And so we can think of cognition as being stress impaired. In comparison to more adaptation-based models where individuals develop cognitive skills and abilities that are ecologically relevant. So cognition is not merely stress impaired. It might be stress impaired along some lines. They don't want to deny that there aren't negative effects from stress, certainly. but that rather we can also think of cognition as being, in some circumstances, stress adapted. So they have a nice quote here that deficit-based approaches are incomplete because they critically miss the social and cognitive skills that develop in response to adversity. So what they're really interested in looking at is how, again, and this is in an educational setting, how individuals who develop in harsh environments develop in turn particular adaptive skills, right, certain cognitive strategies that enable them to deal with those environments, but in cases where they are met with sort of low risk environments like traditional school settings, those skills aren't allowed to sort of materialize or develop or be sort of acted on. So this is the reason for the title of the model, right? Hidden talents. So the idea is that these individuals have these talents, they have these cognitive abilities, but they just aren't allowed to manifest because the environmental conditions are not such that they would be relevant to those settings. Okay. So this is just a schematic of the hidden talents model, and I won't go through all the details here. This is redrawn from Ellis et al. 2022, where the early life conditions of harshness and unpredictability down here lead to stress adaptive skills in particular contexts. They also do lead to trade-offs and skills. Again, they're not saying that stress is good and that full stop, or that it's good for children to develop in harsh environments. They're certainly not saying that to any degree. But what they're saying is that the skills that they do develop are often overlooked and are often very adaptive in certain contexts. Okay, so we should expect to see success in unpredictable environments because of the match between the particular cognitive strategies that develop and the environmental settings that allow those strategies to manifest, basically. And so what they're interested in doing, again, from a sort of education perspective, is thinking about how we might capitalize on stress adapt. Can you see my cursor? You can? Okay, good. All right, good. So how we might capitalize on stress adaptive skills such that they can be employed successfully in normative environments or low risk environments as well. Okay. And there's also a question, and I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A. I think this is particularly interesting. How we might, again, capitalize on stress adapted skills by crafting environments in such a way that allows those skills to manifest. So not necessarily, making the classroom really chaotic, but allowing them to do things like move around, right? Encourage more active learning that is really genuinely active, right? Things like that. Okay, so just two, on the previous slide here, you might have noticed there are two hypotheses that are sort of embedded in this model. This is a large block of text, I apologize, but just to go over them briefly, what these hypotheses are capturing is really the ecological sensitivity to context that's at the core of these theories, right? So the specialization hypothesis posits that harsh and unpredictable environments do not exclusively impair cognitive abilities. Instead, individuals become developmentally adapted or specialized, potentially enhanced, for solving problems that are ecologically relevant in such environments. And I've highlighted that because, again, I want to really emphasize that there needs to be this matching between cognitive strategy and environmental context. So similarly, the sensitization hypothesis posits that hypothesized advantages in cognitive function among people who grow up under stressful conditions, as per the specialization hypothesis, are manifested primarily under currently stressful conditions. That is, earlier life experiences sensitize later responses to stress. So again, just to go back to the model briefly, right, we should expect to see success in unpredictable environments as a result of having the sort of skills, adapted skills for dealing with those environments, coping with those environments. Okay. So just to give, excuse me, two quick examples that I think are really fascinating. There was one study that they found that young Brazilian street vendors that are unable to solve complex arithmetic problems in school-like settings can solve these same problems quickly and accurately while selling and buying goods on the market. So the idea is that these enhanced skills can manifest in ecologically relevant contexts. So we might, sort of think that there is a cognitive deficit in cases where students are not able to solve problems in school settings, but yet they clearly have those skills. It's just that they're not able to manifest in those particular settings. Another example that I think is really fascinating, and again, sorry for the block of text, but I'll read it out because I think it's a really interesting example. They found that among rural Yupik Alaska Native people, hunting and gathering over difficult to travel tundra and often extreme weather conditions requires many adaptive skills. The Adapting Yupik Elders Knowledge Math curriculum uses construction of fish racks, pictured here, which is an ecologically relevant skill in rural Yupik communities to teach plane geometry concepts of area and perimeter. So the idea is that anchoring instruction in this cultural context, and this is part of the study that they did, they actually found that it increased performance among Yupik sixth graders relative to other sixth graders who received conventional textbook-based instruction. All right, so again, the idea is that situating content in an ecologically relevant context allows those skills to manifest. Okay. So moving towards an enactive understanding of stress, and this is, I will fully admit, this is the part where maybe we can chat through a bit and see how exactly this might look. What I'm interested in doing here, and this is drawing from chapter 4 of Sensory Motor Life, talking about learning skills and mastering skills over developmental time. I think there's a sense in which we might conceptualize the adaptive calibration between stressful conditions and sort of strategies that develop as a result of calibrating to those conditions as being described in the way that DePaulo et al. Capture here, drawing on Piaget and psychology. So just to go over this really briefly, there's sort of 3 processes that are involved, and I won't read them through here, but 3 processes involved in the sort of building of here sensory motor schemes where perturbations can essentially shape new sensory motor schemes over developmental time. And so we can think, I'll go ahead to the next slide here. We can think of stressors as being conceptualized as perturbations that shape and direct cognitive development through these processes, assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. And so I use precariousness because I really want to emphasize the elements of instability and unpredictability that I think are really sort of at the heart of stress, of an understanding of stress. So we can conceptualize precariousness as the degree to which the environment is perceived as unstable and unpredictable. And so controllable or manageable elements are very difficult, perhaps impossible to track. And stress, hypothetically, then derives from precariousness. As well, and this is sort of built into the previous model, is how plastic responses might develop as a result of perturbations shaping the system over time, right? So precarious environments hypothetically could ramp up plasticity by inducing plastic responses in adapting to that precariousness, right? So if you have lots of instability in the environment, being able to plastically, shift between different responses is an adaptive skill in order to be able to cope with those changes, right? And then lastly, again, this is maybe a bit where we can talk more about how exactly this might look, but I think we can conceptualize stress-adapted cognition as identifying a particular set of vital norms, right? So there's a sense in which the cognitive strategies that develop as a result of being adapted to stress shapes vital norms in such a way that brings about certain, maybe certain sensory motor schemes, or at the very least, certain patterns of responsivity, certain reactions to environmental stimuli. And that gives the sort of overall picture of matching between agent and environment. All right. And just a shameless plug, right? So in my work, I've been looking at how we might understand the contingent effects of perturbations within the developmental niche. That's sort of my jam, is understanding cognition is developing within the developmental niche. So there's a couple of papers that go into that in a bit more detail. And I'll leave it at that. Okay, good. So, and this is the part that I think is, again, I mentioned in the beginning, where I think the sort of meat is here, where I think the really interesting implications come out, is where what we might see as the effects of mismatches between cognitive strategies and environmental contexts. So we've seen how adaptive calibration generates appropriate cognitive strategies for navigating particular environmental contexts. So again, thinking of this as matches between agent and environment. And what I want to argue here is that mismatches between cognitive strategies or patterns of responsivity, however exactly we want to parse that out, and environmental conditions result in incoherences in sense making. Okay, and I think we could say then that incoherences in sense making can lead to certain psychological conditions, such as anxiety and depression. Here I'm thinking of Seneca Dehaan's book, 2020 book, Enactive Psychiatry, which we looked at, right, where she's discussing these sort of disorders of sense making. And so I think something similar is going on here, where if you have mismatches between certain cognitive strategies that have developed as a result of being exposed to certain stressful conditions or certain stressors within an environmental context, and being sort of placed in a different environmental context where those strategies are no longer relevant, I think we can describe that as resulting in an incoherence in sense making. There's something that sort of goes awry in terms of how we might cognitively respond to particular environmental contexts. So happy to chat about that more. So one sort of offshoot of that is, and again, another thing that I've been very much interested in as this project continues is thinking about our attentional capacities and the ways in which the environmental context might shape our ability to pay attention. And so, right, so the adaptive calibration model shows how high instability and unpredictability in the developmental context results in high responsivity in order to deal with that instability. And so I'm interested in the plausibility of stress adaptivity happening over not just developmental time, but over behavioral time as well, right? So we might expect patterns of responsivity over behavioral time to also match a perceived high degree of environmental instability and unpredictability. And so what I think this results in is a reframing of attentional problems, not as deficits, but really as effects of the stress-adapted mind, right? So we should see calibration to environmental context resulting in different cognitive strategies. And all of this is to say that we should expect to have a very difficult time paying very close and careful attention in cases where the environment seems very unstable and unpredictable, and attention shifting is an important skill to have. And in fact, in the hidden talents lab, that's one variable that they've been looking at, is the ability to attention shift very quickly as a result of being sort of calibrated to high stress environments. So what's the solution? This is a bit of a, I like to sort of harp on about this, but we should expect to either modify environmental conditions, that is, make our environmental context more stable and less unpredictable, or we should anticipate different patterns of responsivity and adjust accordingly. So again, this is something that I've been thinking about in the environment or in the educational context, students having a very difficult time paying attention and building environments that capitalize on that rather than trying to basically retrain what's going on cognitively, right? Okay, happy to chat more about that as well. Good. Okay, so just to sum up, adaptation-based models arguably illuminate stress-adapted rather than stress-impaired cognition. We can think of stress as playing a creative role in shaping and directing cognitive development, resulting in ecologically sensitive and ecologically relevant cognitive strategies. We can conceptualize stressors as perturbations that sort of form and reform the contours of cognitive structures over developmental time. And we should expect to see mismatches between patterns of responsivity or cognitive strategies and environmental conditions, resulting in incoherences in sense making. And that's it. Thank you. So thanks to the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science for giving me a home while working on this project, and to the Templeton Foundation for supporting the grant project overall, and my contact information in case you want to reach out. Thank you.
So thank you very much. That's wonderful, Amanda, and a great way to kick us off for the series. So Mason is here live as well and may have a few questions. And for those of you who are watching live, so there's 10 or 11 of you there on the live stream, you can ask questions by posting them in the chat and I will relay them into the discussion here. So I have several questions. There's a nice link. I particularly like the connection with psychological empirical work. It's something that the Enactive approach sometimes has a challenge with, and it's a kind of an ongoing building process to really integrate empirical work, particularly psychological empirical work, I think, with Enactive thinking. So it's really nice to see that kind of resonance existing there, and to see how they, as you say, the different terms might get parsed out in order to find sort of effective ways to communicate clearly with one another without necessarily sort of jumping to assumptions and conclusions and so on. So
sure, yeah.
So I have a sort of couple of questions that sort of follow through on things like that, but Mason being here and voices other than my own always generally being more interesting, I will offer you the chance, Mason, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. This is all just terribly interesting, and I have like half a dozen half-formed thoughts and ideas related to all this. Let me pick on one of the sort of obvious examples that was going through my mind all the way over here, all the way through this was, there's been a lot of research lately on like African American women and stress and the effects of stress on people who live in a world that is, like you said, high instability, high unpredictability. But the other source of a lot of stress is like high frustration.
Sure. Yeah.
Levels of injustice that I cannot seem to do anything about. There's a lot of things in my environment that affect me deeply that are totally out of my control. And we're seeing this coming out in maternity death rates and things like this, so hospitalizations that cause stressing events that have even more negative effects in physiological terms. So I would have had a minor niggle with the sort of psychological effects as opposed to the physiological effects. If we're an activist, we should bring the body into and say, like, anxiety and depression are certainly psychological, but there's also a large amount of like high blood pressure. There's all kinds of other things that come with the stress too that we should also be incorporating. So that's a sort of general framing. I think there's some really interesting ways to think about this in terms of the sort of people who exist in the same environment as me, but because of the environment's effects on them that don't affect me, they have a lot more stress and a lot more unpredictability. Not necessarily unpredictability, but less control. Right. There are things happening that they are powerless to do something about. And it's that powerlessness that is causing a lot of the stress and responses to stress and so on. So I'd like to think through all this with regard to like powerlessness and lack of control and frustration. Yeah. But that's sort of one issue. The other sort of minor cool thing is the possibility of stress adaptivity over behavioral time that you mentioned at the end. I'm thinking about this in the context of playing video games. I've been playing a lot of Elden Ring lately, which is crushingly difficult and fun. you walk in there as a newbie, and one of the first encounters you have just beats the crap out of you. There's no way you can survive this until you develop some skills. And all this sort of online advice is, look, take a deep breath, de-stress, look for the patterns. Those particular attackers are not just a chaotic mess of murdering you. There's like a attack, dodge, attack. And once you get used to the patterns in this particular foe, you'll sort of figure out, you can de-stress, you can see this as a pattern, you can, so over the course of an hour or so of battling this particular devious boss, you learn to not just go, oh God, okay, I'm dead again. But to think about it, to take a deep breath, to look for the patterns, to relax, to take your time and not just go mash of the buttons. So there's particularly good examples in video gameplay and advice about how to play particular bosses for what looks like stress adaptivity over behavioral time. The same kind of patterns of initially being unpredictable, chaotic, difficult to control, you die, turning into something you can learn to read and eventually respond adequately to. So one big long thing about sort of African-American women's stress over lifetimes, but also it seems like this should be useful to understand how people adapt in behavioral time over the course of an hour or so of trying to battle a particular boss.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both fascinating questions and very salient. So it's definitely the case that in the adaptive calibration model and sort of in the developmental psychology research, looking at reconceptualizing stress, they are absolutely taking into consideration physiological factors as well, and the sort of effects that those have really over time in terms of chronic stress, having, sort of elevated blood pressure as a result of chronic stress over time. But I really like that you pointed out how this element of uncontrollability ties into feelings of autonomy or lack thereof, right? And how that plays a role as well. I think that's very important and something that I've been looking at in a different, but of course, everything is interconnected. So tangentially related project is the importance of a feeling of autonomy for well-being. And so as it turns out, right, if you feel just totally out of control of your life, that's going to have a really negative impact on your well-being. And so especially if you feel very out of control you have no control over your environments, that's a very stressful experience, right? And so I think that's something that absolutely needs to be factored in talking about stress. I think we don't often see that enough, where factors about the uncontrollability of the environment play a role in shaping our experiences of what's stressful. To such a degree that, as you pointed out, it's not necessarily the case that even if you're in the same environment, that you're both perceiving the environment the same way. There's going to be sort of nuances to that experience that are shaping your responsivity in different ways. And so I think that's why I'm really emphasizing thinking of precariousness, or at least, harsh, they use harsh environments, but I really want to emphasize this element of uncontrollability, unpredictability, and instability as what's really at the heart of a stressful environment, right? So yeah, I agree that that's an important aspect of it. And in terms of fighting enemies in video games, it's really so this is something I play a lot of video games, and so this is something that I think about a lot. And I had a very similar experience where my strategy is often just try to just get through it, survive. I never think about using potions. I never think about using the special abilities. I'm just keep hacking away. And as long as I survive, then, I've made it through the boss battle. And then I was playing, I just got VR headset for PlayStation. So I was playing Skyrim in VR, which is incredible and has really thrown everything off for me, because now I'm but the real world looks basically just like it. So maybe David Chalmers is right. Virtual reality is genuine reality, right? So, which I've been talking with my students about, which is fun. But right, there is a sense in which, you do just sort of hack away and hope for the best. And I feel like that does sort of map onto some strategies that are enacted in these stressful contexts, right? You just hack away and hope for the best. And those are sort of strategies that match more high stress environments. And so again, in having a more successful experience in boss battles, sort of recalibrating to think of the environment as not necessarily being a very high stress environment, rather being more sort of controllable, more predictable, as you were saying, right? And then that shaping the particular strategies that you take on. So using the special abilities and all the potions that you've been saving up and are using all your inventory space, right? I could go on about that forever. But anyway, hopefully that gets at what you were interested in. But
sorry, could I just add one more interesting dimension of this that I have just started to think about? A friend of mine, former military, likes to joke that not every person who comes out of combat has post-traumatic stress disorder, but most of us have post-traumatic stress. There's something about particular, not necessarily the stress over a lifetime and the sort of perturbations that happen over developmental time, but some particularly awful, world-changing single event might cause a decent amount of stress, and sort of reprocessing that. It's still a perturbation of your system in some way that sort of reforms the cognitive structures over developmental time, but it's one particular incident that might have been really dramatically reshaping, as opposed to a lifetime of general uncontrollability and stress and so on. So how those kinds of events we still have to think of them as sort of the kind of event you replay in your mind, that you're reprocessing, you're second guessing yourself continuously. It might still be that long-term process of thinking about the event or trying to deal with the effects of that event that brings about the kind of adaptations you're talking about here. But still, it's a sort of single event, and this is why I find the feedback here just so fascinating. It's not so much a continuous sort of regular feature in your environment over developmental time, but the internal reprocessing of this single event over a large period of time. So your internal dealing with that event and trying to figure out how to make sense of it, what he could have done differently. I don't have this kind of post-traumatic stress. I don't know what I'm talking about here, but I imagine it's those sorts of internal processing.
We've either lost Mason, or it's possible that I've been lost.
I think
I'm still here and I can hear you, but you've freeze framed in Visio.
Yeah, I think we've lost you.
Oh, no one can hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, I think we've lost. Yeah. We lost Merrick in video form, at least. I think we can still hear you, Merrick. We might have lost him. I can.
Oh,
yeah, he'll come back in a minute.
Here he is. Okay.
I'm back. Okay.
But anyway, I could rant about this for a very long time. This is just stirring up all kinds of really interesting. We should think about this more.
Yeah. Well, so I want to say, there's a sense in which we could think of those sort of like mega perturbations, right? There's one very salient event that very strongly shapes the structure of the system. But I think too, it's important to consider individual variation in terms of what counts as a perturbation, right? So some stressful encounters might not shape cognitive development in the same way that it might do for others, right? So there is, and again, this is why I really want to emphasize the hyper context sensitivity of stress, which is lost when you try to come up with a very generic understanding of stress. And without it, we lose all of those important insights about individual variation. No, that's really interesting. I'll have to think more about that as well. Merrick, we're okay?
We're okay. I apologize.
Okay,
we're talking about precarious environments. So
yeah, there you go.
One that
they're everywhere.
Over which we have, alas, no control. So all there is acceptance, but hopefully it will remain stable from this point on. I guess it makes an interesting link to the discussion, and it's a question that I wanted to follow up on that gets at the discussion you've been having so far, which is the ascribing of the precariousness to the environment. So of course, obviously, when we're dealing with an agent environment system, the precariousness really is going to be across that system rather than inhering necessarily in one aspect or another, which is part of, I think, the point really that you're making when it comes to, for example, the changes in patterns of attention or capacity to engage in prolonged attention. Is under the right kinds of circumstances, hopping around is the sensible thing to do. So, and what I guess is interesting as well is that the diagram you used from sensory motor life with the loops, the precariousness is very clearly in the sensory motor scheme there rather than in the environment per se. So there's an important complementary or aspectual facet to the notion of stress, that it is, or at least, sorry, not stress, it's the precariousness in this instance that we're talking about. That you know, and I think the Elden Ring example may sort of again be a good illustration of it, which is in this case you actually have the opposite of a precarious environment. It's an environment with very strong structures, but the sensory motor scheme is precarious because the bashing won't work. And therefore the sensory motor scheme breaks down, but then gradually over time molds to fit the structures that do exist in the environment. But you've got to break down the old ones before you can make the new ones, or at least they will break down, whether it's a kind of a deliberate endeavor or not. So I think there's I guess again we're very much in the stage of more comment than a question here, but it has to do with, do you have a strong connection or a commitment anyway to the notion of the precarious aspect to stress being assigned to the environment, or is it something that's more systemic and cross environment organism?
Yeah, so my intuition is definitely that it's more systemic. I think that, especially drawing on what I was just saying about individual variation in response. So you know, one person might perceive an environment as being particularly unstable, but another might see it as perfectly stable. And so there is a sense in which it's not solely assigned to the environmental context. There is some precarity that's built into, as you're pointing out, sensory motor scheme development. And yeah, I'll have to think more about that to be able to identify exactly which parts it makes sense to sort of paint as being precarious. But I guess there's a sense in which the entire system is as well, right? So you can imagine with enough training, sort of a shift happening overall where certain cognitive strategies dissolve as a result of being introduced to new environmental contexts, and new strategies are built up over time. And so there's some instability that's sort of built in there. But yeah, I feel like that doesn't really answer your question, but I do think go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it gets at it does get at a response. I guess it's not a question to which there is necessarily a particular answer beyond, as you said, that there's a systemic aspect to it, but it becomes an interesting challenge about how, as you put it during the talk, how to parse that out. It is how do we then go about the systematic investigation of it?
Right.
And I guess that might link to one of another question I had, or it was just you threw out a thread and you said I can talk more about that if you'd like. So I'd like, and that has to do with the changing. Basically, it's the it's that interactionist approach to disability that has come to dominate over the past 20 to 30 years, which is you can either see this as a deficit model or you can see this as an interaction model. And when it comes to, I think the particular example you gave was the idea of capitalizing on the capacity for rapid shifts in attention.
Sure.
And do you, particularly, I guess, given the emphasis in education on sustained time on task and the control of the environment and control of behavior in order to shape it according to what the teacher requires in a given setting. Can you maybe give an example, or maybe just talk a little bit more about this idea of what capitalizing on rapid changes of attention might look like in
Yeah. So I think we want to be careful because again, and this is what the Hidden Talents Lab team is really emphasizing, is we're not saying, this is a good thing that to experience these stressful environments, but we're saying instead that this is an overlooked part of how we might sort of shift things in the environments to be able to allow, in this case, those students to thrive in these settings. So, so something that I've been really interested in, unsurprisingly, is embodiment in the classroom, and thinking about how the typical classroom, and I have a short essay on this that I'd be happy to share if people are interested, but the typical classroom is set up as a highly passive environment, right? Everyone is sort of seated in rows, very much like a movie theater. You have the lecturer at the front, just sort of passively disseminating information, right? And there's no movement. Obviously, everyone's sort of very constrained in their seats. And the problem here, I think, is that when we attempt to employ techniques like different active learning exercises, which are very popular because they can really help students learn better. But when we attempt to apply those techniques to environments that don't match that active sense, that level of activity, that you have this sort of mismatch between what's expected cognitively and what's available to you in your environment. So, if you're asking students to engage really actively while they're, really sort of confined physically, I think, there's an important mismatch there. And so what I've been wanting to explore and really sort of emphasize as part of this project is ways that we can encourage matches between environmental contexts and sort of more active cognitive tasks that we ask students to do. So I've been looking a lot at outdoor classrooms and thinking about how moving outside can sort of help to make for a better match, and other sort of strategies for moving around, getting out of having to be sort of tethered to a computer or tethered to a desk and chair, and just having the capacity to physically move while you're expected to do this sort of cognitive moving as well, right? So does that sort of get at what you were thinking? Or
it does, yeah. No, there's some really interesting links there between, I guess, between a number of different literatures too, right? So the literature on active learning and problem-based learning as well, but also the ecological psychology of Roger Barker and all of those who worked, Louise Shedd Barker and Phil Scoggin and there's sort of a whole the entire team of the Midwest team. So the importance of, as they called it, that awkward term, sinomorphism, right? So the idea that the environment should be complementarily shaped to the action or the joint action in which you want people to participate. But as you say, as is very frequently the case when you try and do something in a standard classroom, the standard classroom is rather rigidly molding the kinds of behaviors that can be evinced there.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I mean that's excellent. I'm going to follow up separately because there's a whole extra conversation that's going to have to go off and take quite a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there. Yeah,
sure is. So we're sort of getting on for time. So I guess I will throw out, just if Mason, if you have any final comments you want to throw in, maybe do so, or forever hold your peace, or at least
sure. I mean,
don't hold your peace.
There's one other aspect of this that I'm kind of intrigued by and just sort of starting to think through. There's this sort of, we can see this in a sort of Aristotelian, not too much, not too little, just the right amount in the right conditions with the right people and so on. Too little stress is maybe maladaptive, too much stress is maladaptive. There's a sweet spot. In certain environments, these skills are going to be enhanced by a moderate amount of stress. I think part of the education context you're raising is a sort of interesting ways in which, I mean, stress that's sort of artificially induced, easy to reduce if necessary. There's a little bit of control over the degree to which the stress is applied. So it's not like causing serious amounts of anxiety and nervousness, but just enough to get you to concentrate on the task and focus on developing your skills and so on. The video game is a good example here. I really am safe in my living room playing. It's not like a monster's really trying to murder me. So, I mean, when the stress becomes too much, seems an interesting avenue for research. You're certainly prompting me to think about when the stress is not enough to prompt good learning. But I'm also, so there's one aspect of it, sort of what does not enough stress look like, and could we find parallel cognitive disabilities? I want to say the sort of comparison between oppressor and oppressed, privilege versus living under context of oppression and so on might be a mirror to that, but I really have to think about this a little more. It seems like, I mean, W. Du Bois sort of double consciousness. There are skills that Black people need to have to adapt to a white dominated society that white people do not need to develop those skills. We are protected from those kinds of stresses in a way that means I as a middle-class white man have maybe over my lifetime had less need to develop what might the other person be feeling in this situation, sort of empathetic skills of reading other people and imagining their situation. I can just ignore all that because I'm protected from consequences of like hurting other people's feelings or making anybody else uncomfortable. They'll placate me as a middle-class white man or something. So there's those sorts of parallels with privilege and oppression that seem really relevant and worth thinking about. There's certainly been a couple of theorists who've been looking at the sort of skills that poverty develops in you, that middle-class, upper-class people just never have to develop those sorts of skills. It's not like middle-class people get better education. We get education in like how to read interesting books in Latin or whatever. Poor people get an education in like which restaurants dump food out behind them that is still edible and tasty at which times of the week or whatever. When you're homeless, there's all kinds of skills you need that us homed people never have to develop. So there's all kinds of what skills might be useful in life that we're protected from having to learn because we don't have enough stress. Just seems like a really useful field to mine for a while to think about ways in which sort of stress less might not be good for us. Or there might be some good skills we could develop if we accepted a little more stress in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And it is definitely the case that a lot of the researchers, both on the biological and psychological side, have been looking at the sort of sweet spot of stress, like where you don't want no stress at all, because then you don't have any sort of adaptive abilities that develop as a result of that. So but obviously you don't want like extreme chronic stress either, because that has just too much of a detrimental effect. So there's a sense in which stress is really sort of critical for development, or full stop, right? Which is interesting to think about. And again, all kinds, physiological stress as well is obviously important in terms of physiological development. And but this is something that I've been thinking about as well, right? So if life is in some ways too easy for some people, and the sort of cognitive strategies that develop as a result of that then don't go on to match certain environments they meet later on, or something along those lines. And again, not saying that it's good for people to be experiencing high stress environments. It's certainly not the case, but that as I was pointing out, that the Hidden Talents Lab is really emphasizing, is that we're just totally overlooking the skills that they do have. They do absolutely have skills that are ecologically relevant, that allow them to flourish, or at least be able to thrive in a way that makes sense ecologically. And so that is just completely overlooked, and we're assuming that everyone is sort of working from the same low stress or low risk environment, which is very much not the case. Right. So when we think about, again, going back to attention, the sort of attentional capacities that students coming from more high-risk environments might have, how, again, sort of capitalize on that in the classroom, rather than just expect them to adapt to these circumstances where it just doesn't make sense to be able to focus very carefully and have sort of to go to William James's distinction between involuntary and voluntary attention, right? Where we should expect to see involuntary attention being really sort of ramped up in these high-risk environments, and voluntary attention being very difficult to accomplish, or to sort of shift the system back into, because of the just sort of ramping up of involuntary attention. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, something I need to think on more, but is fascinating, I think. Yeah.
A superb sort of rounding off of ideas that I think to finish up on. So we've been putting you under stress for long enough at this point. So I will simply say thank you very much. Thank you very much for a really interesting and rich talk that that's done a great job of kicking off this series, and really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Yes. Thank you very much. This is very fun. Thanks again for organizing this, Merrick.
No problem at all. So we'll be doing it again next month. So we look forward to seeing everyone again in about a month's time, actually, for the October ENSO seminar. I'll see you all then.
Okay. Yeah. Bye all.
Bye.
And we are finished now. I will stop.